You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 346, The Constitutional Convention begins. Last week, we covered the events leading up to the Constitutional Convention. This week, we will take a look at the start of the convention and how the delegates set up procedures for the convention itself. As I mentioned last week, the convention was supposed to begin on Monday, May 14th, 1787. Only 2 states showed up on that day, so the delegates pretty much had to just sit around and wait for the rest of the delegates to arrive. Many of them used this time to chat informally amongst themselves, hanging out in bars or in someone's parlor, where they could exchange ideas. I guess technically there was no minimum requirement since the convention had not set any standards yet. The delegates, however, did not want to look like a tiny minority was setting the rules for everyone else. They informally at least accepted the requirement under the Articles of Confederation that delegates from at least 7 states, in other words, a majority of the 13 states, were present. The delegates had to wait nearly 2 weeks until the New Jersey delegation finally showed up on Friday, May 25th. They were the 7th state delegation to show up, making a quorum and allowing the delegates to begin their business. There were at least partial delegations from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. There was also a single delegate from Massachusetts and one from Georgia, but the convention decided that at least 2 delegates must be present from each state in order to represent that state. The convention was scheduled to meet in the East Room of the Pennsylvania State House, what we today call Independence Hall. This was the same 40 by 40-foot room where the Continental Congress had met when it was in Philadelphia. By this time, of course, the Continental Congress had been meeting in New York City for several years. The room was set up with tables so that each state delegation could sit together. The tables were covered in green tablecloths that matched the window drapes. They were surrounded by wooden Windsor chairs where the delegates could sit. The delegates were arranged by geography, with the northern state delegations seating at tables at the northern end of the room, then the middle delegations in the middle, and the southern delegations on the southern side of the room. There were never more than 11 delegations there at any time. Rhode Island never sent a delegation. The New Hampshire delegation did not arrive until July, and by the time New Hampshire arrived, the New York delegation had already left. The states had selected a total of 74 men to serve as delegates, but only 55 of them actually showed up and attended the convention. Many of the delegates came and went during the convention, sometimes gone for days or weeks at a time, so on most days there were probably no more than 30 or 40 delegates present. And of those, maybe about 20 of them were the hardcore who were there for most of the convention and who did most of the work on the Constitution itself. On that first day, the convention accepted the credentials of the 29 delegates from the 7 states that were present. Normally, this would be a rather long and boring pro forma event, but when the Delaware delegation presented its credentials, it noted that its instructions required that the delegation not accept any change that altered the one state, one vote power structure that existed under the Articles of Confederation. Since there were a great many delegates who thought that this was one of the biggest problems that needed to be fixed, those limiting instructions, which set a line in the sand before debate even began, created immediate frustration. That said, this was not the time to argue over that point. Such time would come later. With the state delegation credentials completed, the next thing for the convention was to pick a president, that is, a presiding officer who would preside over the convention. There really was no debate over this. Robert Morris of Pennsylvania rose to nominate George Washington. The honor of nominating Washington was supposed to go to Benjamin Franklin, but he was too sick to attend that day. The 81-year-old Franklin was becoming quite enfeebled by this time, frequently bedridden with gout or other ailments. Franklin actually had to be carried to the convention each day. The warden of the Wall Street prison had sent trustee prisoners, 4 of them, to carry Franklin in a sedan chair from his home, which was about a block and a half from the State House. Now, despite this difficulty, Franklin had made the trips several times during the 2 weeks when they were waiting to get to a quorum, only to have to turn around and go home again when enough delegates had not shown up. Now, it's not clear exactly why Franklin stayed home on Friday when the convention finally did reach a quorum, but by some accounts, he was having a flare-up of kidney stones. It was also raining particularly hard that morning. For whatever reason, Franklin missed the day and requested that Robert Morris take up the honor of nominating Washington to be the convention's president. Now, typically, a nomination might begin by singing the praises of the nominee. In this case, there was little need. Everyone knew Washington was the man. Morris only noted that he made the nomination on behalf of instructions by the Pennsylvania state delegation. John Rutledge of South Carolina was given the honor of seconding Washington's nomination, and he only added that he was confident that the choice would be unanimous. And he was right. It was. Nobody else nominated anybody else. Everybody voted for George Washington. Washington rose to thank the convention for the honor, then fell into a sort of all-shucks response, much like when he was selected as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He told the delegates that he lamented his lack of better qualifications and asked for their indulgence in advance for any errors he might make. When Morris and Rutledge escorted Washington to his chair, Madison took a seat right in front of Washington so that he could begin taking notes. Madison had appointed himself to take notes. No one asked him to do this. In fact, Congress selected William Jackson to serve as the convention secretary on that first day as well. William Jackson was responsible for taking notes during the convention. Jackson had been an aide-de-camp to General Benjamin Lincoln during the war. After the war, he became an attorney and acted as a business agent for Robert Morris. This appears to have been the most contentious vote of the day. James Wilson of Pennsylvania nominated Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Temple Franklin, who he wanted to serve as secretary. Again, I would have guessed that Benjamin Franklin would have done this himself had he not been sick in bed. After the nomination of Franklin, Hamilton nominated Jackson. The vote went state by state, and Jackson won by a vote of 5 states to 2. So why was Madison taking notes when Jackson was the man responsible for doing this? Well, Madison did not trust Jackson or anyone else to keep a full record of the debates, and on that point he was correct. Jackson only recorded formal motions and votes. He did not record any of the debate over those motions. Madison believed a record of the debates would be very important and therefore took it upon himself to record them. As a result, Madison's notes are the best record we have of the debates of the convention. The convention did not really dive into any other issues that day. Instead, it also appointed Nicholas Weaver to serve as messenger for the convention and Joseph Fry as doorkeeper. Both men served similar roles for the Pennsylvania legislature, which normally met in that same room. With the clerical appointments done, the delegates turned to the creation of a rules committee that would determine how the convention would work. After that, it adjourned until Monday. George Wythe of Virginia would serve as the chair of the Rules Committee. He was a longtime attorney and legislator who had served in the Virginia legislature for decades and had also served in the Continental Congress. In Virginia, he had served on the committee along with Thomas Jefferson to recodify the state's laws after independence. He also had served as a judge and a law professor during and after the war. Rounding out the committee was Charles Pinckney of South Carolina. Pinckney was one of the youngest delegates at the convention, still in his late 20s. He was a Charleston lawyer and had served in the South Carolina militia during the war. He had actually been taken prisoner when the British captured Charleston in 1780, but since he was a militia officer and not a Continental officer, they paroled him pretty quickly after that. He served in the Continental Congress after the war and had been a vocal advocate in the Congress to approve this convention. The third and final member of the committee was New York delegate Alexander Hamilton. I'm not going to go into Hamilton's background. You should know who he is. If you don't, shame on you. He was about the same age as Pinckney at this time. Hamilton was obviously very close to George Washington, having served as his aide during the war. And of course, he actually did get some legislative experience serving on the Continental Congress for New York near the end of the war. After the war, Hamilton had gone on to start a legal practice in New York City. He had married into the powerful Schuyler family. He married the daughter of General Philip Schuyler. That certainly increased his stature, but he had a pretty strong reputation on his own for a young man with no respected family of his own. Hamilton had a reputation of dominating most committees where he was appointed, but by most accounts, Wythe generally sidelined his two committee members and dominated the drafting of the rules. Hamilton certainly had input, but Wythe chaired the committee and was very much senior to the two other members. The committee worked over the weekend and reported the rules on Monday. By Monday, a few more delegates had arrived, including delegates from Connecticut and Maryland, so we now have a total of 9 state delegations. The delegates voted on the recommendations of the Rules Committee. One of the most controversial rules, at least for those not in attendance at the convention, was secrecy. In order to encourage free and open debate on all issues, there would be no public records of the debates. Delegates had to take an oath that they would not speak or write about anything that happened during the convention until after it ended. Sentries would be stationed by the doors to prevent any spectators or journalists from trying to overhear debates. At one point during the debates, they moved upstairs to a second-floor room in the State House. Up there, they could open windows, which would help them endure the summer heat, but it would prevent people from sneaking up to the windows and listening to what was going on. The rule regarding secrecy might seem rather anti-democratic today, but keep in mind that the convention was not really a group of lawmakers. They were there simply to come up with recommendations for other people to enact. The members took the secrecy requirement very seriously. George Washington even stopped recording discussions in his private diary. There were a few minor leaks. French officials recorded some information about the convention in letters home, indicating that they had talked to someone on the inside. At one point early in the convention, someone dropped a copy of the Virginia Plan outside the meeting chamber. When it was found, Washington sternly admonished the delegates to be more careful. There were a few private letters that were later discovered that had mentioned some matters that were before the convention, but amazingly, nothing really found itself into the public newspapers or the public discourse until after the convention ended. A second rule involved reconsideration of votes. The delegates would take votes on issues over the course of the convention, but a vote deciding a matter would not mean it was final. Delegates could bring up any matter for reconsideration as long as they gave a day's notice. While there was an argument that this could prevent the convention from actually making any progress by never having anything finalized, it was necessary since votes on controversial issues might cause some entire state delegations to walk out of the convention. Knowing that they could have a chance to reconsider the matter in the future meant that they could stay and continue to debate. Voting would be done by states, not by individuals. Because the size of the delegation had nothing to do with the size or power of the state they represented, offering them individual votes made little sense. For example, New York had 3 delegates present. Delaware had, I think, 5. The Pennsylvania delegation wanted each delegation to have voting power proportionate with their own population, regardless of delegation size, but several delegations from small states threatened to walk out if they did that. In the end, the delegates agreed that each state delegation would decide amongst themselves how that state would cast its single vote. The delegates also agreed that a quorum to do any business would require the presence of delegates from at least 7 states. The convention approved some more basic rules, like an instruction that members would not read, gossip amongst themselves, or interrupt when someone else was speaking. Anyone speaking would address their remarks to the president, not each other, and no delegate, unless given special leave, would speak twice on a subject before every other delegate had a chance to speak. Any member who spoke out of order could be called to order not only by the chair, but by any other delegate. There were other basic rules of procedure, which I won't cover and bore you with here. No one wants me to discuss parliamentary procedure for the entire episode. The Rules Committee also recommended a rule that any delegate could call for a roll call vote on any motion. The majority of delegates actually voted down this Rules Committee recommendation. George Mason argued that putting delegates on the record with a position might make it more difficult for them to change their minds later, so they wanted to keep formal votes to a minimum. Following the establishment of the rules for the convention, the delegates adjourned for the day. While not a formal rule, the convention met for about 5 hours a day, 6 days a week, taking off only Sundays. They would also take off for the 4th of July holiday, and there would be a break later in the summer when there was not much to do. But the reason for these relatively short days on each session was to give the delegates time to go out and have even more informal discussions with each other as a way of coming to consensus. Because of the secrecy rule, they were not allowed to go out and talk with other people outside of the convention, but it did allow delegates to interact with each other a little bit better and talk out these issues without sitting in the convention hall. The following day, Edmund Randolph of Virginia rose to introduce the resolution that the Articles of Confederation ought to be, quote, corrected and enlarged to ensure the, quote, common defense, security of liberty, and general welfare. Now, this made clear at the outset that the convention was going to have a really broad mandate. It wasn't there to just talk about matters of trade, which had been the initial motivation for this whole thing. Randolph's introductory speech mentioned the commercial discord that had arisen between the states. Some states like Massachusetts had dealt with internal rebellions. Paper money was causing havoc. States were violating treaties. The current articles gave the Congress no power to prepare for foreign invasions, to enforce treaties, to raise money, to establish commercial regulations, or really prevent the states from doing anything they wanted. He feared that the United States would fall into anarchy and fulfill the prophecies of those who predicted that a republic could not stand on its own without a king. As head of the Virginia delegation, Governor Randolph introduced Madison's draft plan for a new constitution, the so-called Virginia Plan that I discussed last week. Among its more controversial recommendations was a Congress where states would be represented by population rather than the old one-state, one-vote standard. Again, I'm not going to go over all the proposals in the Virginia Plan here. We talked about them last week, but we will get into them in more detail as the debate begins. The more important thing to remember is that it was the Virginia Plan that would become the basis of discussion as the convention began its debate. To begin debate on the Virginia Plan, the convention voted to meet as a committee of the whole. This was a common parliamentary fiction used at the time and still used today. A committee of the whole means everyone at the convention sat on the committee. The point of doing this was to allow debate and discussion in a more informal way and avoid the more rigid parliamentary rules that would apply when the convention met in regular session. It also meant that Washington would not have to sit at the head of the convention all day, every day. The convention voted Nathaniel Gorham to sit as the chairman of the Committee of the Whole. During the time when the Committee of the Whole met, Washington took his seat with the Virginia delegation and acted just like any other delegate. Now, in this role, Washington was free to debate just like any other delegate. Even so, the general mostly kept his mouth shut. He only rose to speak once during the entire convention, and it was on a relatively minor point near the end of the convention. Washington knew that his name and reputation gave his words far more power than he would have liked. He did not want to be seen as bullying the delegates. Even simply by arguing a point, just like any other delegate, his words would have far more respect and deference than any other delegate would get. So instead, he kept a low profile. This is not to say that Washington never expressed an opinion. He regularly spent time outside of the convention, speaking informally with other delegates and sharing his opinion on things. He just didn't want to be seen as dominating the debate at the convention itself. While the delegates debated in the Committee of the Whole, Washington was trying to stay above the fray. Gorham of Massachusetts was a longtime legislator, serving in the provincial Congress and in the Massachusetts legislature. He'd also been a delegate at the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention and was a state judge. He'd also recently served as president of the Continental Congress. The selection of Gorham appears to have been pretty uncontroversial and perhaps decided through outside discussions ahead of time. The vote was 7-1, with the one vote going to John Rutledge of South Carolina. The vote was taken in secret, but I've seen other historians speculate that the vote for Rutledge came from Gorham himself, just to appear humble and to keep the vote from being unanimous. Once Gorham took his seat at the head of the convention, the Committee of the Whole took up the Virginia Plan as a matter under debate. Next week, we'll dive into that debate, and we will cover the most controversial issue that the convention would face. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks as always to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. And thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Patrick LeBeau, Kurt Avard, and Greg Dusak. I also want to welcome Kelby Miller, who joined as a standard bearer on Patreon earlier this month. Like everyone who supports this podcast at the $10 level or higher, Kelby will receive a magnet each month with a different flag from the American Revolution. All Patreon subscribers who join for as little as $2 a month will still get access to commercial-free episodes and invitations to live events. I really do appreciate everyone who supports this podcast and helps make it possible. Now, this week we covered the first few days of the Constitutional Convention. The delegates took their time getting everything set up, appointing officers, and establishing rules. Many of these men were lawyers, and many more had experience serving in other legislatures, so rules for the convention did not seem to get much controversy. Perhaps the most controversial vote was the one state, one vote policy for the convention. Representation in the new Congress that they were creating based on population or state would become the most controversial question at the convention, and one I will discuss next week. But I don't think the agreement to set one state, one vote for voting at the convention said anything about what the delegates actually felt about how the next Congress should vote. For outsiders, the secrecy rule was probably the most controversial. Everyone in the country knew that the most important men in the country were meeting to discuss major changes on how government should work. Yet, no one knew what was going on for the entire summer and fall that the convention met. Thomas Jefferson, who was in France at the time, wrote to John Adams, who was in Britain, calling the rule abominable, and that it showed a, quote, ignorance of the value of public discussions. Those at the convention, however, recognized the need to let the delegates speak freely without every speech being examined by the country and bringing on lots of outside pressure on every issue that they had to address. If delegates went on the record publicly, it would be harder to change their positions to reach eventual compromise. Years later, Madison defended the rule, arguing that delegates initially expressed such divergent and crudely formed opinions that considerable debate was needed to refine them and make them ready for public disclosure. I should also say something about Madison's notes on the convention. As I said in the main episode, they really are the best records of what we have from the convention. There were a few other delegates who kept some notes, but they were not there for the entire convention. In some areas where we have another note taker, we can see that Madison's notes do seem to line up with them, meaning that he seems to be giving a pretty straightforward account. As I said, Madison was participating in the debates as they were going on, but he was also keeping the notes all day, every day during the convention, and he spent much of his after-convention hours fleshing out the notes that he had taken during that day, so he was keeping pretty busy through this entire time. Unlike the convention itself, Madison kept his notes a secret. He did not want to have his notes used against various politicians who had been delegates at the convention, or to allow the convention debates to become a weapon to be used in the party warfare of the early federal era. Madison used them for his own reference and worked to edit them over his lifetime, but they were not published until after his death. Since he lived longer than any other delegate, when his notes were finally published in 1840, no other delegates were around to question his version of events. My book recommendation this week is called Decision in Philadelphia, The Constitutional Convention of 1787 by Christopher Collier. Now, this is another good look at the convention. However, it is a fairly simple look. I think this book was designed for a younger student audience, probably not middle schoolers, maybe high schoolers. The book itself is less than 100 pages, not counting notes and index. It has plenty of pictures as well. So if you know a younger person who's interested in understanding the convention, or maybe you want to read it and you just have a shorter attention span, this is a good starter book. It was first published in 1986. If this sounds interesting to you, get Decision in Philadelphia by Christopher Collier. And there's also a copy of it on archive.org that you can browse, so if you just want to check it out, you might want to look there before buying. My online recommendation is Notes of Debates in the Federal Convention of 1787 by James Madison. As I said, James Madison notes are the most authoritative source that we have on the convention debates. So if you want a primary source, this is the place to start. Madison's notes were first published in 1840, and so of course are in the public domain. I've placed links to an edition of the notes from 1966, but the book is freely available on archive.org. Madison's notes are extensive. The book is almost 700 pages long, and there is no notes or index to it. So while it is an interesting read, you're going to have to be really dedicated if you want to read it cover to cover. My question this week asks, there is a story that Alexander Hamilton used his swimming skills to escape British fire. He was underwater so long that the soldiers thought he was dead, yet he emerged fine. Is this story true? Well, the story is a good one. In September of 1777, as the British were approaching Philadelphia, Washington was preparing for a final stand along the Schuylkill River to prevent the British from reaching Philadelphia. The commander became aware of a flour mill on the British side of the river. He deployed Hamilton along with Light Horse Harry Lee and a small force of soldiers, either to seize the flour for use by the Continentals or destroy the flour in order to deny it to the enemy. The officers deployed a few pickets to warn them of the arrival of the enemy, then set about dealing with the flour. The officers heard the picket fire, warning of the approach of British dragoons. Hamilton and several soldiers jumped into a flat-bottomed boat and began crossing back across the Schuylkill River. Lee and several other mounted soldiers galloped away toward a nearby bridge. According to some accounts, Hamilton and his men came under heavy fire while in the boat. One man was killed and another wounded. In these accounts, Hamilton dove into the water. He was underwater so long that his fellow soldiers thought he had drowned. Eventually, though, he emerged on the far side of the river thanks to his swimming skills that he had acquired as a youth in the Caribbean. Washington received a note about Hamilton's death. While he was reading it, a water-soaked Hamilton entered the tent to Washington's great surprise and relief. It's a fun story. It's not one I recounted when I covered these events in my American Revolution podcast episode on that time period. I've never been able to find any primary source that corroborates this story. Now, the basis for the story seems to come from an account in Light Horse Harry Lee's memoirs. Lee said that when the dragoons arrived, Hamilton and several other soldiers began crossing the river in a boat. Lee and several other mounted soldiers galloped off toward a nearby bridge. Lee reached the bridge in safety. The bridge was guarded by Continentals. From there, he could only hear in the distance British fire directed toward Hamilton in the boat. Lee dispatched a courier to Washington saying he feared Hamilton might have been killed. While Washington was reading the note, Hamilton returned and reported that he was concerned about whether Lee had survived. There's nothing in the account that Hamilton had to swim underwater to evade the enemy or that he was soaking wet when he returned. Lee was too far away from Hamilton to see what was happening. His fears were based only on hearing the enemy fire from a distance. Now, in truth, an officer, a lieutenant colonel, abandoning his men on the boat to dive into the water for safety would have been seen as an act of cowardice at the time. Even if all the men jumped into the water, Hamilton not staying with the wounded would have put him in a very poor light. Given Lee's account in his memoirs, I'm comfortable with the story that Hamilton was attacked and that he escaped across the river on the boat. I also believe Lee when he says that he sent a dispatch to Washington with concern about Hamilton's life. I don't find any source that makes me confident that Hamilton swam to safety or that he dramatically entered Washington's tent just as Washington was reading about his feared death. Those seem to be embellishments to the story. They could possibly be true, but I find no primary source to confirm them. Therefore, I have to presume fictional embellishment. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.